June 6, 1944, Normandy, France. 00:07 hours. The night was silent, too silent for war. A thin mist crawled across the fields near the village of Bénouville, blanketing the River Orne in ghostly white. Crickets chirped, and in the distance, a lone German sentry lit a cigarette, the small orange glow flickering in the dark. He had no idea that within the next 10 minutes, history itself would land almost on top of him. Above the calm French countryside, 6 lumbering Horsa gliders sliced silently through the night sky. Inside each, 30 British soldiers gripped, their rifles, Bren guns and Sten submachine guns, faces pale under the dim red glow of the cabin light. They were from the 2nd Battalion Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, men of the 6th Airborne Division, led by Major John Howard. Their mission, to seize a small but vital crossing over the Caen Canal, Pegasus Bridge, before the Germans could destroy it. The flight had been brutal. For hours, they'd been towed by Halifax bombers across the English Channel, each glider shaking violently in turbulence. Every man aboard knew the stakes. If the Germans blew that bridge, the eastern flank of the D-Day invasion would be exposed. If they failed, thousands of men storming the beaches at dawn might never make it off them. Howard checked his luminous wristwatch. 00:10. He looked around at his men. Lieutenant Den Brotheridge, Sergeant Wagger Thornton, Corporal Fred Greenhow, all silent, all waiting. The tow rope snapped. The sound was like the crack of a whip, and instantly the glider dipped into a steep descent. "Hold tight!" Howard shouted over the wind. The Horsa groaned as it hurtled toward the ground. No engines, no second chances. The pilot, Staff Sergeant Jim Walwork, squinted through the darkness, eyes locked on the faint glimmer of moonlight reflecting off the canal below. They had one chance to land, one chance to stop in time before ploughing into the river. Through the open slits of the glider's nose, the black outline of Pegasus Bridge came into view, closer, larger, terrifyingly near. Walwork's hands gripped. "The controls! Stand by for landing!" he yelled. The impact came like a train collision. The glider smashed into the earth at over 100 miles per hour, skidding across the field. The men were thrown forward. Helmets cracked, rifles clattered, sparks flashed as metal scraped earth. And then, stillness. The first glider had landed just 50 yards from the bridge. Exactly as planned. Howard blinked away the shock and unbuckled his harness. "Out! Out! Move!" The side doors burst open. Soldiers poured into the night, forming up instinctively. No shouting, no confusion, just training taking over. They had rehearsed this moment hundreds of times in England, right down to the number of steps between the glider and the bridge. Lieutenant Brotheridge took his platoon forward, creeping through the dark field. The sound of frogs croaking masked their footsteps. Ahead, the steel structure of Pegasus Bridge loomed like a shadowed beast, its girders lit faintly by the moon. A German voice echoed faintly. The sentries on duty were chatting by the canal bunker, oblivious. Howard whispered, "Fix bayonets." The faint metallic clicks rippled through the squad. The air thickened. Brotheridge sprinted first, leading the charge. "Come on, lads!" The paratroopers erupted from the shadows like ghosts. Grenades flew. Sten guns roared. The Germans barely had time to react before the British were among them, bayonets flashing, shouts mixing with gunfire. Brotheridge fired his Sten into the nearest machine gun nest, then threw a grenade toward the bridge's control bunker. It exploded with a deafening crack, stone and dust flying. The bridge's defenders were stunned, half awake, half dead before they understood what was happening. Howard's men fanned out, sweeping each side of the canal. The sound of battle was brief, but violent. A German MG-42 barked from across the water, cutting the silence for a moment before a Bren gun answered it with fury, and then, just as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The firing stopped. Smoke drifted over the bridge. A few German voices cried out, then faded. Howard looked around. His men were alive. The bridge was still standing, but on the ground, Lieutenant Brotheridge lay motionless, hit by a burst from the final German machine gun before it went silent. He was the first Allied officer to die on D-Day. Howard knelt beside him for only a moment. There was no time to mourn. He stood, turned to his men, and said, "Hold the bridge. Reinforcements or not, we hold." The first objective of D-Day had been taken, and no one in Normandy yet knew it. 30 hours. Pegasus Bridge, Normandy. The night air still trembled with the echo of gunfire. Smoke curled lazily above the canal, drifting past the skeletal frame of Pegasus Bridge. The gliders had landed so close that two of them now rested, almost against the bridge's embankment, splintered but intact. Major John Howard's men, though scattered and dazed, moved like clockwork. Years of discipline condensed into a few heartbeats of precision. Each platoon had its role: clear the bunkers, secure the bridge, set demolition guards, establish defensive perimeters. Sergeant Thornton barked orders as his men dragged the wounded to cover. Corporal Tappenden positioned his Bren gun on the bridge's eastern approach, while Private Smith crawled under the structure to check for explosives. Every sound, a creak of metal, the splash of water, the whisper of a breeze, felt like it could mean danger. Howard crouched by the bridge control post, his radio operator frantically tuning the set. Static. No signal yet. The rest of the British 6th Airborne Division was still somewhere in the night, scattered across the dark French countryside. For now, they were alone, between the Germans and the sea. "Sir," shouted Private Hooper, "we've got one live German here." A dazed Wehrmacht soldier was pulled from the ruins of the guard post, his face pale, his uniform smeared with blood and dust. He was young, barely 20. Howard stepped forward. "Where are your reinforcements coming from?" he demanded. The soldier hesitated, trembling. "Ranville. Maybe Caen. I don't know." Howard narrowed his eyes. He knew enough. The enemy garrison at nearby Bénouville was bound to react soon. He turned to his men. "We've got minutes, not hours. Get those guns set up and eyes on the road." The British paratroopers fanned out, taking up positions along both banks. Sandbags were piled, ammunition distributed. A few men, still shaken from the crash, silently crossed themselves. And then a faint rumble. From the east, down the narrow road that led through Bénouville, came the unmistakable growl of an engine. Then another. Howard froze, straining to listen. Tanks. The first counterattack was coming. Lieutenant Smith's men on the eastern approach braced themselves. The darkness seemed to pulse with every rotation of those approaching treads. Moments later, a German armored car emerged from the tree line, its headlights slicing through the mist. Howard whispered, "Hold fire! Hold!" The armored car rolled, closer, oblivious to what had happened at the bridge. A dozen yards out, it slowed, the commander leaning out from the hatch, and then, now! A thunderclap of gunfire erupted. The Bren guns burst, tore into the vehicle, followed by a well-aimed Piat shot from Corporal Bailey. The bomb struck the car's front plate, detonating in a flash of orange. The explosion shattered the night, sending metal fragments raining across the road. The vehicle burned, lighting up the bridge like dawn. The paratroopers cheered, but only briefly, because now everyone in the area knew exactly where they were. Howard turned to his runner. "Get to the canal house. Find the landline. Try to reach command." He glanced at the bodies on the bridge, the young German sentries who had barely woken before dying. Then at Brotheridge, lying still beneath the structure that had cost him his life. "Damn fine officer," Howard muttered. Nearby, in the dim light of the burning wreck, Lance Corporal Greenhow stood staring at the water. His glider had crash-landed into the canal minutes earlier. 2 men were still missing, likely drowned. It was the only real failure of the operation, but there was no time to dwell. Every man knew what was at stake. The bridge had to stay intact until reinforcements arrived. That was the order. That was the mission. 1 hours. From the south came small arms fire, sporadic but closer each minute. The Germans were testing their defences, patrols moving in, probing the bridge from both directions. The paratroopers returned fire methodically, their shots precise, calm, measured. Howard crawled to the command trench. "Any word from 6th Airborne?" His radio operator shook his head. "Still nothing, sir." Howard exhaled. The men were low on ammo, low on supplies, cut off from communication. But they still held the most vital crossing in Normandy. Then, just as another burst of fire echoed across the canal, a single sound cut through the chaos. The distant thump of parachutes opening. Howard lifted his head, staring up into the black sky. Tiny silhouettes drifted down. Paratroopers. Reinforcements. The 7th Parachute Battalion had arrived. For the first time that night, he allowed himself a grin. "Looks like we're not alone anymore, lads." But the fight for Pegasus Bridge was far from over. The Germans were regrouping, and the next assault would come with armour, artillery and fury. The paratroopers tightened their grips on their weapons. Dawn was coming, and with it, the battle for the future of Europe. 3 Panzer hours. Pegasus Bridge, Normandy. The mist over the Caen Canal had thickened, turning the world into a damp grey haze. The paratroopers crouched low in their foxholes, every nerve stretched thin. Their uniforms were soaked, their faces streaked with grime and sweat. The adrenaline that had carried them through the assault was fading now, replaced by exhaustion and anticipation. Across the still water, the Germans were stirring. The dull thud of boots and clatter of weapons carried faintly through the fog. Somewhere in Bénouville, an officer was shouting orders. Engines coughed to life. Major John Howard crouched near the bridge control post, his Sten gun resting on his knee. His eyes flicked between the approaches, east and west, where his men lay in wait. The 7th Parachute Battalion had linked up, but their ranks were thin, scattered from the chaotic night drop. Still, they were enough to hold, for now. Corporal Tappenden was digging in along the eastern embankment when the first shell hit. A blinding flash. A roar that shook the ground. The explosion threw up mud and splinters, raining debris across the bridge. Men ducked instinctively, pressing their helmets into the dirt. "Artillery!" someone shouted. Another shell slammed into the far bank, lighting up the mist with a searing orange bloom. The Germans had found their range. Howard crawled to the edge of the bridge, yelling above the noise, "Keep your heads down! Hold the line!" A burst of MG-42 fire raked across the steel girders, sending sparks flying. The British returned fire in controlled bursts, the staccato rhythm of Sten guns echoing over the canal. But through the fog, more shapes appeared. Dark, silhouettes advancing low and fast. German infantry. The defenders opened up. The air turned electric, bullets cracking, grenades thudding, shouts echoing from both sides. The once silent countryside was now a living inferno of smoke and sound. Lieutenant Fox led a section across the bridge, reinforcing the far side. His men fired through the gaps in the girders, cutting down Germans who tried to crawl forward. For every one they dropped, 2 more seemed to appear from the mist. "Where the hell's our armour?" Fox yelled. Howard's voice came back through the din. "No armour! We're it, lads!" A sudden shriek tore through the chaos, the whine of treads grinding against the road. From the eastern approach, a German tank lurched into view, a Panzer IV, its cannon sweeping across the bridge like a searching eye. The paratroopers ducked. The tank fired. The round slammed into the embankment, sending a geyser of dirt and shrapnel into the air. The concussion nearly blew Howard off his feet. He hit the ground, ears ringing, vision swimming. Then a voice cut through the haze. Corporal Bailey again, the Piat man. "Got one shot left, sir?" Howard nodded. "Make it count." Bailey crawled forward, dragging the heavy launcher. He waited, watching the tank grind closer, its treads clattering against the stone. The smell of fuel and cordite filled the air. He rose just enough to aim and fired. The Piat roared. The bomb flew true, striking the Panzer's track in a blinding flash. The explosion echoed across the fields. The tank lurched violently, one tread torn apart. Flames burst from the side hatch. Cheers erupted from the British line. "You got it!" Bailey dropped back into cover, breathing hard. His ears rang, but his grin was wide. The Germans faltered. Their momentum broke. Small groups began retreating into the fog, dragging wounded and shouting for medics. But Howard knew this was only the first test. The full counterattack would come with daylight. 30 hours. Dawn crept over Normandy in shades of pale orange and blue. The smoke drifting from the burning Panzer glowed faintly in the early light. The paratroopers, filthy and weary, still held Pegasus Bridge, but they were running dangerously low on ammunition. Howard checked his watch again. It was almost time. If the plan was on schedule, British forces from Sword Beach would be pushing inland any minute now. He turned to his radio operator. "Try again. Get me any signal from the beach." The man nodded, fiddling with the dials. "Static, then. Ox and bucks. This is Sword. Hold fast, we're coming." Howard exhaled slowly. Reinforcements. They were coming. He turned to his men. "You heard that, boys. The lads from the beach are on their way. Hold that bridge like your lives depend on it, because they bloody well do." The men smiled, tired but fierce. They adjusted their helmets, reloaded what little ammo they had left, and settled in. The rising sun illuminated the bridge fully now, its white steel frame standing defiantly against the smouldering landscape. Beneath it, the bodies of the fallen, British and German alike, lay silent testimony to the night's fury. Pegasus Bridge was still in British hands, but before the relief column could reach them, the paratroopers would face one final, desperate onslaught. 5:30 hours. Pegasus Bridge, Normandy. The dawn haze lifted, revealing the brutal beauty of the battlefield. Smoke from burning vehicles drifted across the canal, mixing with the scent of oil, cordite, and blood. The once pristine French countryside was now pockmarked with craters and scattered wreckage. Major John Howard stood near the bridge's control tower, his uniform torn and streaked with mud. He scanned the eastern approach through his binoculars, movement among the trees. The Germans were regrouping again. "They're not done with us," he muttered. Sergeant Thornton joined him, reloading his Sten gun. "We've got less than 3 magazines per man, sir. Maybe 2. Howard nodded grimly. "Then make every shot count." The men of the Ox and Bucks Light Infantry and the 7th Parachute Battalion crouched in silence, the tension like a drawn bowstring. They had been fighting and waiting for over 5 hours. No sleep, no reinforcements. Just the sound of their own breathing and the occasional crack of a sniper's rifle from across the canal. At the edge of the village of Bénouville, German infantry were assembling, hundreds of them. Trucks arrived, unloading more men. 2 more armoured vehicles rolled up behind them, one a self-propelled gun. Private Hooper, peering through his scope, muttered, "They're bringing the whole bloody regiment." Howard dropped the binoculars and barked, "Positions! Get that Piat loaded!" Corporal Bailey, still nursing a bruised shoulder from the earlier shot, grinned. "Didn't think I'd need to do that again this morning." The German artillery opened up. Shells screamed overhead, exploding near the far bank. Dirt and debris rained down, tearing through the trenches. The paratroopers hugged the earth, grit filling their mouths and eyes. Then came the infantry, dark shapes advancing. Across the open ground, shouting in German, rifles raised. Machine guns rattled from the hedgerows, tracers cutting through the rising daylight. "Open fire!" The British line erupted, Bren guns hammered. Stens chattered in bursts. The air filled with the deafening rhythm of small arms fire. Every inch of the bridge became a fortress of defiance. Sergeant Thornton shouted orders over the noise. "Target the gunners! Keep their heads down!" Private Jones, crouched behind a makeshift barricade, squeezed off short bursts, each shot deliberate. He'd been awake for 24 hours, his hands trembling, but he refused to miss. Every German that fell slowed the attack, bought them another minute. And then the second tank appeared, a heavier model this time. Its cannon fired point blank, the shells slamming into the bridge structure. The steel groaned under the impact, but held. The paratroopers ducked as fragments of metal clattered down. "Piat! Where's that bloody Piat?" Howard yelled. Bailey was already in position, belly to the dirt, aiming carefully. The weapon's spring creaked as he loaded the projectile. The tank's turret turned toward him. Slowly, inexorably, he fired. The Piat bomb streaked out and hit the tank square on the turret ring. The explosion rocked the vehicle, flames erupting from inside. Its machine gun went silent. German soldiers scrambled away, some throwing themselves into the canal. Cheers rose again from the British side, but it was cut short by another sound, the roar of aircraft engines. Howard looked up. For a heartbeat, his mind raced. Friend or foe? Then, through the cloud cover, came the shape of a British Typhoon fighter bomber, swooping low. Rockets whooshed past overhead, striking German positions near Bénouville. The explosions sent black plumes of smoke skyward. The pressure lifted. The Germans were breaking off, falling back into the trees. Their advance had stalled. Howard exhaled, chest heaving. "That's it. They're pulling back." The men looked around, stunned. The bridge was still theirs. For the first time in hours, silence settled over Pegasus Bridge, an uneasy, fragile silence. Private Tappenden slumped against a sandbag wall. "Bloody hell! Thought we were done for." Thornton nodded. "We still might be." Howard checked his watch again. Owned 6:30 hours. The sun was climbing now, warm light cutting through the smoke. He turned to his signal man. "Try the radio again. Sword Beach should be inland by now." The man nodded, adjusting the dials. Static, then faintly. "Horsa 1, this is Lord Lovat. We're on our way." Howard froze. "Say again?" "Lovat's commandos. ETA 15 minutes. Howard smiled for the first time in what felt like years. "You heard that, lads. The commandos are coming. We're getting out of this alive." Around him, the paratroopers exchanged weary, incredulous grins. Some laughed, others cried quietly into their sleeves. They had held against overwhelming odds for nearly 7 hours. They had done the impossible. But before the Green Berets of Lord Lovat's commandos appeared, the men of Pegasus Bridge would witness one last, unforgettable scene, one that would etch itself into history forever. Aero 7.15 hours. Pegasus Bridge, Normandy. The morning sun burned through the mist, revealing the battered expanse of Pegasus Bridge in full. Smoke drifted lazily across the canal, the smell of gunpowder and blood still hanging in the air. Bodies, lay where they'd fallen, German sentries, British paratroopers, and the wrecks of 2 tanks that still hissed as fire licked their hulls. Major John Howard stood at the center of the bridge, leaning on his Sten gun. His men were ghosts of themselves, faces smeared with soot, eyes hollow, uniforms torn to ribbons. They'd been awake for nearly 20 hours, but none dared to relax. The Germans might return at any moment. Then, faintly from the east, came a sound. At first it was distant, impossible to place. Not the thunder of guns or the drone of aircraft, but something rhythmic. A strange, steady pulse carried on the morning air. Pipes, Scottish bagpipes. Howard frowned, lowering his weapon. "You hear that?" The men perked up, listening. The sound grew louder, clearer, until there was no mistaking it. The haunting wail of bagpipes playing Blue Bonnets Over the Border rolled across the French countryside. Then, through the shimmering heat haze, figures appeared on the road. Marching briskly, rifles slung, helmets gleaming. At their head strode a tall man in a commando beret, his sleeves rolled up, and beside him, playing those bagpipes, was Piper Bill Millin. Lord Lovat and his commandos of the 1st Special Service Brigade had arrived. Howard couldn't believe it. After all the chaos, all the waiting, the relief force had marched straight from the beaches, 5 miles inland, in perfect formation, as if on parade. The paratroopers on the bridge began to cheer. Exhausted voices turned hoarse, but the sound rose and rolled across the canal like a victory cry. Howard straightened his back, forcing a smile despite the ache in his legs. He stepped forward to meet them. Lovat, ever composed, nodded. "Sorry we're 2.5 minutes late." Howard laughed, a short, cracked sound that came from deep in his chest. "You're right on time, sir." Behind Lovat, the commandos began fanning out, securing the perimeter, tending to the wounded, and checking for signs of a renewed German attack. Piper Bill Millin stood at the edge of the bridge, still playing, the pipe's notes rising defiantly into the clear Normandy morning. Howard looked around at his men, the remnants of the 2nd Ox and Bucks, mud-caked and bloodied but unbroken. He thought of Lieutenant Brotheridge, the first man to fall that night, and of the glider crews who never made it off the canal. Every inch of this ground had been paid for in sweat and blood. He turned back to Lovat. "Bridge is secure. No charges, no enemy armor in sight. They threw everything they had, sir." Lovat nodded approvingly. "And you held. Good work, Major." As the commandos moved through, Howard's men finally allowed themselves to rest. Some sat down where they stood. Others took long pulls from canteens, staring blankly into the distance. A few simply lay back and closed their eyes, listening to the bagpipes and the gentle lapping of the canal. The relief force pressed onward, moving past the bridge toward Ranville, where other elements of the 6th Airborne were regrouping. For Howard's company, the mission was complete. Pegasus Bridge, the very first objective of D-Day, was theirs, taken and held against impossible odds. 8 Sikhs hours. The sun climbed higher, illuminating the red, white and blue patch on their shoulders, the WWII, winged horse of Pegasus. It was fitting that this bridge now bore that name in honor of the men who had descended from the sky to take it. Howard walked to the railing, gazing down at the calm water. It was hard to believe that only 8 hours earlier this had been a silent French backwater. Now it was a symbol, a beginning, because this bridge was more than just a crossing. It was the first victory of the liberation of Europe. The paratroopers had shown the world what courage looked like in the dark. Men who landed in silence, fought in shadows, and held until dawn. And as Piper Millin's music faded into the distance, the men of Pegasus Bridge finally understood. They hadn't just taken a bridge. They had opened the road to freedom.